So this is a case where there is a poor contact point between the second and the first molars, and the second molar has already been treated, and the reason I wanted to do them separately is that it's really hard to work on them at once. I would never attempt to do so because um, the challenge is that if I remove all the existing restorations, I will lose all my reference points. So I decided to do them separately. While working on the second molar, I used the first molar as a reference. Now I will use the second molar as a reference for the first molar, and I will also use the plastic model of the upper teeth to recreate the correct height of the cusps of the first molar. This is how I safely open the contact point by removing material, leaving a thin wall of composite that protects the adjacent tooth. I do the same on the mesial side. So now, as you can see, I removed the thin wall of composite and I can visualize the distal side of the premolar. And there is a caries which I'm going to fix as well. So the hardest part here is carefully removing the composite while preserving as much of the tooth structure as possible. I'm going to use different methods for this purpose. It's really difficult to distinguish the particular composite used by the previous dentist because even though I have UV filter, it doesn't work well with this composite. Also, the color blends with the tooth structure, making it quite challenging. If it's possible to separate the composite from the enamel, I do so using the Excesso curette. This is preferable because it allows me to avoid prepping, which helps preserve the tooth structure. However, the adhesion to enamel is quite strong and it's not always possible. So there are a few ways to distinguish composite from tooth structure. UV light is my favorite, but it's not always reliable. Another method is to dry composite after prepping, as it turns whitish and becomes easier to spot. I use high magnification for this. So this is basically it. I use UV light, I prep composite, I dry it, and I look at it under high magnification and prep again. So it could take a while, but I preserve as much of the two structures as possible. I don't want to prep the marginal ridge of the premolar, so I use this opportunity to conservatively prep the caries. So I take a silicon impression of the upper teeth to create a plastic model which I will use as a reference when building the vestibular cusps of the first molar. Just cleaning the teeth before isolation. The rubber dam placement is pretty straightforward, so there's not much to explain. So this is what it looks like. I filled the impression with resin for temporary crowns, and now I have the upper teeth. Now I'm doing sandblasting and the adhesive protocol using OptiBonafel adhesive as usual. I've shown this in previous videos, so I won't explain it here. I put another clamp on the first molar for vestibular retraction. So this is called adaptive layer, and this is the first layer of the restoration. I use flowable composite for this purpose. So this is highly filled flowable composite with high viscosity. I use it not only as adaptive layer, by the way, but also as a final layer in some areas of the restoration. And if the restoration is really small, I can even do the entire restoration with this flowable composite. So in this case, for the premolar, I used a packable composite as a base and a final layer of flowable composite. And you can see how it adapts to the surface, how it rounds and shapes it perfectly. I'm not doing much here, but the composite forms the wall itself. This is why I like to use it in such cases. I work on the vestibular aspect of the tooth first, so I can remove the clamp and continue building the restoration. The microscope is recording while I'm working in direct vision, so I'm not looking through the microscope right now. I also use a flowable composite here to smooth the irregularities on the vestibular side. Now I'm building the cusps as they are, testing and adjusting them with my plastic model. So my main concern is not making them too low. If they are slightly high, I can adjust them and the restoration will integrate into the occlusion. But if they are too low, then what's the point of the restoration at all? So as you can see, there was a tiny gap between the matrix and the tooth, which I fixed with the Teflon tape. So there is pretty large distance between the teeth, and when I place the wedge between them, the matrix doesn't naturally adapt to the adjacent tooth, so I help it by using the condenser to roll and adjust the matrix. I build the marginal ridge as usual, applying a bit of flowable composite between the matrix and the tooth. Then I add packable composite and carefully adapt it. So I built the wall in two layers. The first layer I used to adapt the composite wall to the junction between the tooth and the matrix. Then I use my condenser again to push the matrix toward the adjacent tooth. While I am doing so, the assistant cures the material. After curing, the composite holds the matrix in place, and the next portion will be used to form the marginal ridge. I'm gonna build the distal vestibular cusp and the marginal ridge together because it's easier. I use the central cusp as a reference point. The same technique I use for the mesial side. So it's time for my favorite part, and it's like a prize for all the work that I've done. Now it's time to build the anatomy, and there is not much to talk about here. I use the cusp by cusp technique, so each cusp is formed from one increment of composite. I carve the details in uncured composite with thin instruments, and then light cure. This way I build the anatomy of all my restorations.